submissives use this to avoid adulting, and dominants use this to avoid having to be considerate. Just because you're the submissive doesn't mean you just get to be the helpless princess all the time. And just because you're the dominant doesn't mean it's just your way or the highway.
Our question today comes from Natalie, who writes that she's in a BDSM dynamic with her boyfriend. The two of them had a fight over something that had nothing to do with sex or their dynamic, but during the course of the argument, her boyfriend mentioned a very personal kink that Natalie shared with him. She has never shared this kink with anyone else, and she feels him having brought it up in a fight as a way of shaming her was a violation of her trust in him. Outside of this fight, they have a good BDSM dynamic, and they're open and careful about communicating with each other. But him bringing up a very personal kink during an argument like this has her feeling violated and less trustful of him.
Naturally it would. I mean, she's not wrong. He definitely broke one of the core tenets of fair fighting in general, but certainly within a kink dynamic. We can break that down a little bit more precisely using some of the language I use in the book, where from a Jungian perspective, the entire point of kink is to be able to dive into the shadow, into those sides of yourself that society rejects and shames you for, and to bring those up and to enact those and to recomplete yourself in a more integrated way. But if your intimate partner is playing the role of society, not playing the role of an intimate partner, then all of a sudden that entire mechanism gets shut down because now you're not safe. So there is a pretty significant violation of trust and safety here in a way that is not trivial, but also not unrecoverable. The core of this, though, in order for him to recover that, is he has to very clearly own, hey, that was fucked up. Yeah. That was a violation of the boundary of our intimate relationship, where I'm now bringing society in where society doesn't belong. And we need to... So by owning it and apologizing, I think people can move forward. But you can only do that if you really realize that, hey, yeah, this is a pretty serious fuck up.
Yeah, I do feel that this was a significant violation, because the next time she wants to bring up a kink or explore another dimension of the relationship, she's always going to be wondering whether or not this is going to come back to haunt her. And if she can't do that feeling safe, she can never truly be authentic. And if she can't truly be authentic, she can never truly be intimate with him. And this is definitely something that they're going to have to sit down and talk about and really try to get themselves through. She's right to feel violated. She is right to feel like this is a major concern. This is not something that was done just well. I said something in the heat of the moment. This is not one of those things you can take back and say, well, I say things when I'm angry. This is like...
This is, hey, I fucked up and I need to never fuck up this way ever again. You get one mess up in this arena.
Right? Yeah.
And
you get really, one free pass.
I mean, you can come back from one thing, but if it ever happens again, it would... I think the intimacy of that relationship would be basically forever damaged by a second event. And so he needs to take some serious steps to make sure it's a never again event. And... We talk, it's an interesting notion to branch off from here, but we talk a lot about the notion of when you're setting up a dom-sub dynamic with a new person, the notion of safety and keeping the submissive safe, or even keeping the dominant safe, and that safety and trust and all of that. And we often frame that, I think, in terms of physical safety. But I think that while physical safety, of course, is important, it's a bit obvious. What's maybe less obvious is this type of safety, is intimacy safety, is can I reveal to you that this is what I really want and not be shamed for it, but to have that received, even if it's not shared. So even if you're not into the same thing I am I able to reveal this to you and not have it used against me the way society would? And that is a form of safety.
That might be a good label for it. Is he a safe container for my vulnerabilities or not?
Correct. Although that goes both ways. Like if the dominant says, hey, yeah, you know what? Like I'm really sadistic. I want to clamp your nipples, or I want to slap your pussy with a belt, and like whatever. She may not be into it. That's fine. But is she able to hear it? Is she able to receive him as a person and be a safe, intimate partner, even if she's not going to participate. So you're setting up, let's say it's a new relationship. There's a way to say, hey, no shame. That's great. Like, you're into that. I don't think we're compatible, but yeah, I hope you find your person. And I think that that's a part of setting up a new relationship. And this is why it's always so tricky when people get into a relationship and haven't admitted to themselves that they were kinky beforehand, or realize it later, or develop an interest later. And now it's like, well, we have this whole history of this whole relationship. Maybe this person isn't able to receive it, or is saying, hey, like, maybe we're not compatible. And that may be the truth of it, but that's a tremendously challenging situation.
It also depends on what exactly they were arguing about. She said, or she writes that they weren't really arguing about BDSM or anything. And if it was a really trivial thing, like, well, you said you were taking the trash out yesterday and now you didn't, right? And if it's something as trivial as that, I think the error is even worse, because it didn't take much at all for you to use some of my deepest, darkest secrets against me. It shows a tremendous lack of maturity on his part and a violation of trust on his part that really needs to be worked through if it was truly a trivial fight that they were having.
I've been in this scenario on the dom side of things where, so it was towards the end of a relationship, things were already tense, and the fight was about where the relationship was going or whatever the deal was, and she was screaming at me, and then she threw out like, you're supposed to be keeping me safe, you're my daddy, you're supposed to not, whatever. And I was like, yeah, and if we're playing that game, you're my sub and you need to be quiet and listen. Right? So clearly we're having a discussion that is outside the dynamic, and you can't throw the dynamic in as a control mechanism or as a way of generating the outcome that you want. And so that's a very dangerous road to step on.
A great example. A great example of how it could work the other way around. You're not even really violating trust. You're just leveraging the dynamic as a emotional cudgel. It's like, well, you're supposed to do this because
so you shouldn't argue with me. You shouldn't fight. You shouldn't make me angry, or you're supposed to make me feel safe and whatever. And I was like, right, and you're supposed to be obedient and be quiet when I tell you to, but that's not we're not doing that right now. We're having an actual conversation in a relational sense because this is not working. So you have to be able to step outside the dynamic, no matter how pervasive the dynamic is. It can be a 24/7 dynamic, it can be a whatever, but there always has to be that ability to step outside and have a conversation about the relationship as equals in some sense.
Right, yeah.
Otherwise, you really lose room to move in that space.
That actually raises a very interesting notion of the idea of moving outside of that dynamic, so you could, from the outside, talk about it, or at least talk about issues that cannot be solved through the dynamic itself. And so, hey, we need to sit down and decide if we're having kids. We're in a dominant submissive relationship. You want to have kids. I don't want to have kids. And you can't leverage the dynamic to force that decision. That has to be an extra. It has to be outside the dynamic to be able to have a real conversation about values and where you see yourself. And they cannot be, the dynamic cannot be used to solve all problems, I suppose, is another way of putting that.
That's exactly right. And I think there's a bit of temptation there to say, well, I'll just spank you into whatever, and then, I'll just submit to it. And on both sides, I think that submissives often use this to avoid adulting, and dominants often use this to avoid having to be considerate or to consider the other person's needs. And so for both people, there has to be some intention and some willingness to step outside, as we've said, and to really engage in the difficult conversations of well, just because you're the submissive doesn't mean you just get to be the helpless princess all the time. And just because you're the dominant doesn't mean that on core decisions like having kids, it's just your way or the highway. And so there are those things. And part of that is the value of the safe word. That's really the last bastion of, hey, safe word, we need to step outside this dynamic. And again, this is something that's often talked about in terms of physical hurt. Oh, you hit me too hard, safe word. Oh, this is happening, oh, safe word. And again, I go out of my way to try to coach my submissives, at least. The safe word is anytime we need to step outside the dynamic. It can be in the middle of, hey, we're having a conversation and all of a sudden we've got a difference in values. It's totally fair to say the safe word, and then we're going to have this conversation in a different frame. And that's a totally valid use of the safe word, but it's not used often, or it's not discussed often enough. And that means it may not occur. And that can also lead to some tension. I think in a lot of these situations, hopefully people intuitively step outside the dynamic, but not always. Sometimes that goes astray, and having that ability to say, oh, this is a safe word moment, to reinforce that that's what we're doing is useful.
Yeah, it's worth emphasizing this point, because there could be some submissives where the dynamic is very dominant sub or master slave, and they don't know that they can do that. They don't know that the safe word allows us to arrest the dynamic, step outside of it, and start advocating for your needs or express concerns that you feel may not be adequately addressable within the dynamic itself. So especially for submissives, it's important to step outside and say, hey, I need your attention. I'm safe wording. And then it should arrest everybody's attention in the dynamic so they can sit down and have a very serious conversation. Right now, of course, if it's spanking and you hit me too hard, that's much easier to resolve. That's not a larger issue that requires a resolution. But if it is, if it's more of a relational thing or a break of trust sort of thing, like it was in this question, safe wording is a good way to plant a flag in the ground and saying, hey, something has gone wrong, and I need your attention to really think about this, think about what had happened.
Yeah, and I think I've talked to people who downplay the importance of a safe word, or they think at some point you'll grow past needing a safe word. And I'm like, look, if you think you're God and you're flawless, then maybe, but there's always the potential for error. And so that ability to step outside is very important, because that's the thing. I talk about this in the book. I frame BDSM as being played in the twilight of the half real. And it's not totally a game. It's not just silly play, right? But it's also not really real. And this is one of those examples where you can make the mistake of making it too real. Is that, oh, I'm a slave. I don't have a voice. I can't step outside the dynamic to have a conversation about whether we're going to have kids or not. No. You've made the mistake of making this too real, unless that's a negotiated thing. I think there are people maybe even who play at that level of commitment. And that's cool. Like if that's pre-negotiated, that yes, even impregnation is totally on the table. But that should be a negotiation that was done explicitly beforehand, outside of the dynamic at some point. And that's what allows you to avoid, I think we talked in another episode, to avoid getting higher on your own supply and believing that the dynamic is more real than it is. It's half real, maybe 3/4 real. But when you start making it 100% real, I think you end up in a pretty dangerous situation.